Provocateur.media.
I mean, I think of Tony Montana and Scarface, right? It's like, what did he say? First you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women. Do I have that right?
Yep.
So it's almost like everything that is wrapped up is sort of like the male expectations of being financially successful and powerful ends with you got the ladies.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater-Adler, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater-Adler, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome to the Goldwaters. I'm your moderator, Dan Delmar, and as usual, we have the Goldwaters here with me today, or just two of the three, actually. We have Dr. Samantha and Daniel, and France is off this week. She is, I guess as we say in Quebec, en période de réflexion. She's going to take a bit of a media break, and she's thinking about her potential political career, and she'll be making an announcement on the podcast soon. But Daniel, Samantha, today we'll be discussing masculinity. How did this topic come about?
I was crushing beer cans on my head, and my chest hair was being conditioned and combed, and Samantha's like, "You're so manly. We should talk about this."
So we're going to talk about how men are changing today. Is the prototypical stoic figure, the John Wayne, the Marlboro Man, are those sort of passé? We're going to talk about the link between violence and masculinity, the future of manliness, and much more. But first, let's take a look at sort of contemporary masculinity and just plunge right in to where we are with, of course, Donald Trump and sort of the evolution of masculinity in America. Manufacturing jobs in particular were pretty much a cornerstone of the masculine identity in America for many years. That is slipping away. Is the masculine identity evaporating along with those so-called Rust Belt jobs that Donald Trump appealed to so much? And is there any saving it? Should we save the masculine identity?
Well, speaking as a man, it's odd for me to relate personally to this topic because I'll just put out right away that I have trouble relating to this meme of the decline of men and I guess the rise of women as its corollary. I could observe the trends. I mean, as you just kind of introed with Dan, the idea of the breadwinning male in, say, rural Rust Belt America who is supporting the family on a factory job that's no longer there and threatening the man's sense of breadwinner and all that, and having real consequences in society. But I find it difficult to relate to because I just personally don't feel threatened by this rise of women. I could acknowledge that it's happening, and rise of women or maybe decline of men, however you want to brand it. But I just personally have problems relating to it and the resentments behind it. Maybe I'm not angry enough.
Maybe that reflects more, socioeconomic status. And a lot of the classic kind of manly factory jobs and minor jobs and, strong working man jobs don't really apply to being a lawyer. That these things, that being a lawyer is not in decline, or being in the professional class hasn't really been touched by the same economic forces as a lot of the blue collar working jobs have been.
Well, just to push back on that a little bit, to stick up for my lawyer bros, that actually their faculties, law faculties across the country, and I believe in the States it's the same thing, are more and more dominated by women. I went to Université de Montréal law school, and I believe the ratios were something in the range of about 65-70% women. It was really was female dominated, and I think you're seeing that. I mean, that's also, I think, part of this meme is that men are having trouble keeping up, at least outside the STEM subjects, they say, right? Keeping up with women in terms of university achievement. And you're seeing that in the law faculties. Even our generation, it's interesting. If you think back to our grandmother, my mother's mother was the first woman to get the highest mark on the bar exams, provincial bar exams in her day. and she won I believe a medal for it. I forget, it was the Medal of Paris. I should know this.
Yeah, it was related to Paris or France. Yes, Ruth Goldwater.
Right, and in my experience in law school, I mean, again, women were there and they were kicking butt.
Well, you make a really good point, and there's been a similar move in psychology. It's been really quite dramatic in psychology. In fact, it hasn't gone. It's slowly creeping up into academia, but in terms of the people that are becoming psychologists, it's by far women at this point. In academia, there's still quite a large representation of men, but that's kind of those dynamics are changing as well. But I guess whether, I similarly had a bit, let me echo some of the difficulties I had with the subject of masculinity and the death of masculinity, that I feel that we tend to be extremely invested in our gender concepts and constructs, that to be a woman means this, to be a man means that. And maybe it's just that I've studied a lot of statistics and normal distributions and things that has sort of shaped my view of this or affected how I see these constructs. But I just think that there's so much variability in people and within each of these constructs of what it means to be a man, that I don't really see how you can have the death of it. I just see how you would have a shift. You'd have changing dynamics. I don't think that a man needs necessarily to be blue collar, hardworking, supporting the family, that this is what a man needs to be. I think that there's a lot of wiggle room within there, that you can still be a man and have a powerful identity and feel confident about that without fitting into these narrow constructs.
Sure, you could have a man bun and wear espadrilles and short, tight shorts or whatever it might be, and you're still, I guess, a cool dude today. So I think, though, that, if you had to reduce it, I guess, to what is the essential difference in my mind between men and women that still persists to this day, and maybe this is going to sound too primal, is just that we're still bigger. We're physically larger than women. And on
average, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty evident. And I think that always kind of, that's why I don't feel threatened maybe by the rise of women. I just kind of feel that, I feel like a self-hating, effete liberal male when I say this, but men have dominated history and really often through threat of physical or sexual violence. And so to let up the reins on that, I don't see the tables turning, because
I guess you're not worried about women are going to take over through violence and sexual violence.
No, and if women want to have white-collar jobs and make more money and allow guys like me to raise little kids, go ahead, great. I'm applauding it. Take care of us.
Well, it's interesting because originally, again, when we were approaching this topic, and I thought, what is masculinity to me? What do I think of masculinity? I had a lot of, I had some difficulty with this, that I was just thinking, well, I guess a lot of the traits that I admire in men and respect in men are the same ones that I admire and respect in women. And I was putting on this very equal playing field. But then when I thought about it a little bit more, and I thought about, what are the times where I've looked at a man and thought, ooh, that's a man, in the best possible sense for me, like where I've had that feeling of admiration and respect and attraction. It's been, to be very honest, a lot of it has really come down to being responsible, loyal, protective, strong in mind or in body, that the man doesn't have to be, a muscle man necessarily or have no vulnerabilities, but still be stronger than I am in some sense. And I think a woman, I want to be protective as a woman, but I want a man to be more protective, or my man to be more protective than I am. And having a certain easy confidence, and that includes feeling confident enough to not see me as a threat, and not need to debase or lower other people in order to feel big and strong and powerful.
Okay, but even when you're saying, to be protective, though, just to me, immediately what jumps out is kind of what I was just alluding to before. I think of physicality. I think about my male experience, and when I try to contrast it to what I imagine to be the female experience, has to do in many ways with the threat of physical or sexual violence. I keep coming back to this, but I think back to my more, when I was younger, my high school years, or when I was a young adult. Now I'm an old adult, and I would go to, say, clubs or going downtown, and there's always that. It started to occur to me that, all right, if I were a woman in this situation, there is like threat of potential sexual or physical violence at every turn when you're going out, say clubbing in a big city, that guys might start grinding on you. They might try and apply you with alcohol or getting up in your face and be like, yo, you're catcalling, all these things that are, I think, have been unpacked in the public discourse now. Just was something I never had to face. And so I've never felt threatened by women. I keep attaching it to that sort of physicality, and maybe you're right, Samantha. Maybe it has to do with the fact that economically, I'm a white collar class person. I'm more I'm not a struggling high school educated guy in the Rust Belt or whatever it might be. So maybe those economic social forces just don't appeal to me.
Yeah, they may not apply the same way. I can definitely, resonate with. I guess, some of the physical threats that come with being, if I think of masculinity, and I guess if I think of, what I admire in a man, or when I think, man, there is, you're right, a lot of it does come into a certain physicality and an attitude and confidence that goes along with it. But it's this idea of and I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying it's not something I necessarily noticed about myself until really giving this matter a lot more thought and reflection, that I still do want a man who is bigger, stronger, and protective, but not going to be threatening, menacing, or harmful. And my experience, when I was a young woman, and still to a certain extent now, was marked by, I guess a very approach withdrawal relationship to men, where I, mostly heterosexual and still found, guys appealing and attractive and wanted to date and explore that. But there was also a very real and, for me, extremely conscious fear that went along with that. It was and that did affect a lot of my, my sexual development, which was just that there was always that thought in my head that, even if I want to be with this guy, then he could still rape me at any moment. This could still happen. And so I always had to be very careful. And so when I think of things now in terms of my conception of masculinity and what I desire, I do want a certain protective component, but at the same time that's non-threatening to me, at least, and to our family. And in terms of the economic factors, I think that does fall under the male kind of traditional protector role. You're going to protect the family.
And chivalry. I mean, this dovetails perfectly with the notion of chivalry. I mean, the very notion of warrior codes throughout all cultures, whether it's like Bushido in Japan or classic European chivalry, my understanding of it, I mean, I have a history degree, actually, I had a class on this, is the notion that you had these often mercenary armies, sort of these, that in times of war were very useful in society. And then in times of peace, it's like, okay, we have this violent gang of misfits who've been raping and pillaging our enemies. Now they're just idle. What are we going to do? And so naturally, organically, a lot of societies came up with this sort of chivalric code. It's like, well, you have to rein in this natural male propensity towards violence and sexual violence through codes of engagement that are civil and restrained. And to me, I think that maybe this is where we're on the same page. If I had to define what I think makes a man, is to be aware of that potential in every man. I mean, myself, only speak for myself, I can't speak for all men, that within me at any time, I am biologically and culturally positioned to engage in a lot of physical violence or abuse of other people, often women. And to be aware of that and to do what I can to rein it in.
We'll talk a bit more about violence in the male mind in a little while, but just briefly, guys, back to Trump and sort of the movement as well, the alt-right movement, their use of very loaded gendered terms, manly or masculine terms, for lack of a better word. What are your thoughts on cuck, for example, as an expression that became very popular during the last election campaign, directed against opponents of Trump? Daniel, do you want to maybe just go into a brief lesson on the term cuck and how it's been used politically lately?
It's the diminutive of the word cuckold, and as in a man who is cuckolded by his wife having, say, an affair with another man. And so, and in the alt-right vocabulary, there's also a racial component as well. If you dig deeper in this, that often in the myth behind this idea of being cuckolded is that it's also a black man who's having sex with your wife. This comes up a lot in the memes about when they use this expression that you're a cuck. And so yes, it's a term to sort of feminize your opponents, that you are being, you've lost your masculinity, you're being taken advantage of. And it's also, lastly, cuck-servative is often an expression that comes up to make fun of people on the right who are not hardcore enough. So you're cuck-servative.
One tweet I will quote from comedian Jenny Slate goes pretty much like this movement, this alt-right movement in Trump, is the last death squeal of the patriarchy. Is that something that you agree with, or do you think that this is sort of a movement that is everlasting, that there will always be a part of society that wants to express their masculinity in a very aggressive way?
Well, my automatic reaction when I started to become aware of this cuck-servative expression out there on the right was that it just struck me as really pathetic. It sounded like this might make me sound like some, chauvinistic guy, but that these are guys who are sexually frustrated. What type of language is that to be using in political discourse? That's where your mind is going, that that sort of women are being taken away from you, or that someone's sexual privileges are being threatened. I mean, so my automatic reaction was that it smelt of men who have sexual troubles, who are not successful with women or who feel threatened by that.
And I guess in fairness, and this probably feeds into the same attitude and the same mentality that birthed kind of the cuck term and this being used, is that it strikes me as a very beta male thing to say.
Exactly.
Which is, touching on what you're saying, which is this idea that, to me, a man is confident and doesn't need to, well, if I think of the traditional masculine definition, a man is confident enough that he doesn't need to debase or defend himself against nonsense, that he's confident enough in his identity and in his place that these things sort of rub off on him, or just slide off his back. And so to say things like that person is a cuck just tells me that, okay, it tells me a few things. As one, you believe that women are property, and that the biggest insult that you can think to tell another man is that his property is being taken by someone else, which is just distasteful and gross. As a mentality and thing to put forward. And the other thing it just tells me is like, okay, well, you don't have any real arguments then. Like, you have no real arguments against what the other person's saying. The best that you can think of doing is to say that, someone took your property, or na 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 na, which strikes me as very juvenile and maybe boyish and not mannish.
No, it's profoundly juvenile. I do have to say, though, I mean, again, it doesn't appeal to me. I find it juvenile and all the things Samantha just said, copy-paste. But at the same time, I could see its appeal, that there is something maybe this speaks generally to the vulgarity of this sort of Trump era and this sort of new right that we're seeing, is that there is something cathartic about hearing in a certain political discourse just like outrageous juvenile statements that are just being bandied about. Like it's like a thumb in the eye to political correctness, which is, of course, an underlying component to all this new right that we're seeing.
Let's go from attitudes to violence now, and a couple of notes there. We could talk about terrorism, about suicide bombers, mass shooters. We've debated the religious aspects to this. Is this a product of one religion versus the other, or imperialism? But there's one thing that almost everyone can agree on. All of these people who perpetrate these kinds of crimes essentially are all men. What does that mean?
I think part of it is... part of it comes down to basic biology and comes to testosterone. And testosterone, women that have more testosterone are also more aggressive on average. And men, by virtue of having a Y chromosome and testicles, produce more testosterone than women on average, and are physically bigger, and traditionally, again, historically, have really been revered for being physically powerful and expressing their physical might. So I think now, I don't think it's an accident that you still have that most perpetrators of violent acts are men. I think it's still obviously deeply disturbing. And I think that, well, I'm interested in what your perspective, as the man here, as the Y chromosome here of the Goldwaters.
Right. I go beat up guys in the streets all the time.
That's true. You're pretty macho,
really
macho
tough guy. I have a gun rack with no guns on it. Right. It's interesting because when I think of male violence, yes, obviously it's always 90% of all violent crime is committed by men. I mean, this is a give or take. And yet there is, of course, the testosterone component, the basic biology. But one interesting observation is that, it tends to be a crime, of, say, an underclass, right? I mean, there's different types of crimes, right? You think of white-collar crime as something that, say, someone who's white-collar would engage in. And so when you think of physical violence and mass shootings, these tend to be, there's this theme that these are sort of, again, sort of beta males, like frustrated men, often who express sexual frustration, often young men expressing sexual frustration, whether it was you think of the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida by this Muslim man who apparently was confused about his sexuality and had problematic relations, I believe, with his previous wives. And also, I think the Isla Vista shooting, this was the young, creepy young guy, right, who had these videos about how he felt very angry towards the fact that he wasn't getting laid and that he was angry at other guys who were getting laid and angry at women who were not laying him. And this propelled him to engage in horrible violence. So I think that, so added to the testosterone thing, I think there's this idea that access to women is something that men really need or require in a cultural context. I mean, there's obviously a sort of a biological component, but I think that so much of, I think of Tony Montana and Scarface, right? It's like, what did he say? First you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women. Do I have that right?
Yep.
So it's almost like everything that is wrapped up is sort of like the male expectations of being financially successful and powerful ends with you got the ladies. And I don't know if that's just that is not just purely biology. I think that has to do with the fact that men have been culturally expected to be breadwinners, like economically, and to support a family, and women were in the private sphere taking care of hearth and home, and that men who feel that they don't have access either to career prospects, they're economically disenfranchised, and that somehow gets related to a sexual sort of aggression, because then they feel, well, I can't get a woman, I can't be that proper role of a man that society expects of me. And that is where a lot of violence and frustration, I think, really stems from.
You mentioned Tony Montana. I wanted to pick up on that because it seems like the unbridled violence and freedom, in a way, I guess, debauched freedom expressed by Tony Montana and Scarface is a model for a lot of men. And I don't know about you growing up, guys, but it seemed like an awful lot of my guy friends had Scarface posters in their room. What do you make of the idolization of that kind of character?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be judgmental. I mean, it's a good movie, but I, in my mind, associate it with kind of beta males, guys who are obsessed with Scarface. I don't want to be upsetting to any audience members. Again, it's a good film; it has its merits, but the type of man who has that Scarface obsession, it speaks to me of a man who is frustrated in his masculinity. It's just like, well, you're living vicariously through this image, probably because you feel that you can't
secure a powerful position in society on your own or without resorting to these means. And I think, to kind of follow on what you're saying, Daniel, I think that, if we're gonna take as a basic given that either biologically or culturally that men tend to be more aggressive, and that there's in order for men to function in society and for societies to function, then you need to kind of domesticate men in some way, that they need to, sort of channel those impulses or those urges that are so encouraged when it comes to war times or other things, and when it comes to manual labor work. But then when it comes to, being within a society, you can't have men kind of running around raping and pillaging and killing. And so there's a bit of this sort of culture that's sort of thrown, superimposed on top of chivalry, of ways to be able to channel your aggression, of this idea that if you follow these rules, if you follow these societal rules, then you will get rewarded in some way. You'll get money and or power and or women. And these are the things that are going to happen if you bend to this domestication. It's going to be in your interest. And I think for the men that feel that they're following the script, that they're doing what they're, quote, supposed to be doing. Like, I try to get a job, I try to work hard, I subscribe to your views of domestication, when a man is supposed to be in society, and I'm not getting any of this stuff you said I was going to get. I'm not getting the woman. I'm not getting the power. I'm not getting the job. There's this huge frustration. And I find, on a much lesser level, you'll hear that kind of coming out when guys talk about the friend zone. That they'll say, well, women have told me and feminists have told me all this time that all I have to do is just be nice, like just don't be a jerk. And if I'm friends with women, and if I offer to, if I ascribe to egalitarian ideals and I offer to cook them dinner or something like that, then this will be a transactional thing. And then I will, then sex will come to me and this woman will come to me as a relationship. And then this huge frustration when they realize that, wait a minute, I can still do, quote, everything right and not get the thing, and the thing being the woman. And so there comes this anger and this aggression that has this sort of non-specific anger and aggression, like, hey, I followed the rules, where's my stuff? Like, I worked hard, I went to my job, and where's my money?
And I think this has to do also with, maybe a cure to this, or something to help is trying to navigate your way. I'll speak for myself. And when I was growing up and going through my adolescence and trying to navigate my own masculinity and inheriting all the tropes of what a man is supposed to be, like, I don't know, throwing on the pigskin or something, I at one point had to be like, well, I'm not really that guy, okay? I am not the traditional jock, okay? I'm not a varsity dude, okay? I'm a bit off, okay? I would consider myself, closer to a nerd spectrum, but it never. I had to still deal with that at one point. Look, I have to admit the appeal, that primal appeal of the jock who gets all the babes and who is big and muscly. I grew up on Saved by the Bell, and I had to witness that and then find well, how am I going to get access to women? Really is all that really matters in adolescence. I can speak for myself. And I found some sort of maybe less hyper masculine niche that worked out for me. I found, women who were more like-minded, who were attracted to that type of man. And so I didn't feel so threatened. I imagine if I was living maybe in a more closed society where that's really the only thing that's available and there's only, cheerleaders and football players, and that's the only thing that's available, and then I might be more frustrated. Growing up in something more cosmopolitan helps.
Well, and I think cosmopolitan, sure, but I think what you're selling, what you're selling yourself short here is that there's a lot of aspects of masculinity that you still, of traditional masculinity, that you still fall under, that still that a lot of people still find appealing in this society. So even if you're saying, well, I wasn't a jock, I'm not that that's not my thing, you got into doing a lot of exercise and going to the gym and doing weightlifting. You got into Muay Thai, which is super hyper aggressive, masculine. You're also a large dude. Like, you're a tall guy. You're fit. You have big shoulders. You're a physically big guy, and you're in a position of relative economic power. And so you're still someone who can be, even if you're not engaging in football, you still can be, quote, successful in the current model of masculinity. And I think it could be very different if you don't fit into those other boxes and you feel like you're going through all the motions and you're like, okay, I did the, if you're more social, you're also quite socially adept. And for guys that may be a little bit more socially awkward, that may not have economic power, that may be smaller.
Catch. I'm really impressed with this readout. I'm muscly and economically successful and socially adept. And
this the whole purpose of this episode was just supposed to be a dating ad for Daniel.
I'm going to start squatting and doing push-ups. You just watch me and describe to the audience.
You're rippling muscles and the sweat on your brow.
Sure.
But I think that for...
But this comes down to physicality is another theme I think that we're gravitating towards.
But physicality and also still position in society, because there's also that you're not, were you poor? Were you poor, had a lower education, or more socially awkward also? So in terms of social hierarchy, in terms of economic hierarchy, then I think things, the physicality definitely does play in.
Well, being socially at ease is always going to help anybody in any, social configuration. But I think, too, going back to high school, I remember making this observation at the time. There was a guy who I will not name who was very successful with the ladies, right, back in my high school. And I remember being like, this guy doesn't really have much going on. But he was large. He was large. He was also socially adept. He was not sort of the big odd kid in the corner. But there was this I often felt that the popular guys, there was almost like this hierarchy. I remember making that observation with my friends that like it kind of comes down to who can beat up who in high school. Like no one really talk about that. It's not that explicit, and people have their there's nuances.
An interesting fact in terms of the bullying research. Right. Yeah, physical size and appearance makes no difference really in terms of who's going to be bullied or not in women, in girls. And in boys, the only physical aspect that makes a difference in terms of increasing your risk of being bullied is physical stature being smaller, and that will increase your risk. So yeah, I think I think physicality. You're right. It does play a really big role. I don't think it's a sufficient role. I don't think it's the only part, but it does definitely come in there.
It also is, red shirting. Right? In the States, it's more popular. This refers to parents who used to be that parents wanted to skip their kids ahead in school if they were gifted, but now the trend is to keep them a year behind so that they're, particularly for the boys, they'll be physically larger and have, say, be naturally more leadership potential as they go through the cohort.
But also have better social skills, like better emotion regulation skills, better social skills, because they're a little bit older. And that social skills does play, in the bullying research, that plays in across the spectrum for boys and girls, that the ones that are more socially isolated have social communication problems. The ones that are easy pickings, the ones that are just outside of the pack, that they're the ones that are much more likely to be to fall victim or to be picked on in that context.
Are there any manly men in real life or perhaps in pop culture that either of you looked up to, or Daniel, that were perhaps even formative for you?
That's a very good question. I don't know if there's a particular male figure that comes to mind. I mean, there's basically my father. I mean, not to sound cheesy, but I loved my dad. I looked up to him as the male ideal, as I think many boys do. But for me, when I think of it, I have to reduce it to its essence. The things that I maybe latched onto were male fitness, male physicality. I'm a little shy to admit this, but the movie Fight Club, with Brad Pitt and all cut and the six pack, and this notion of the ultra cut male was something that I think was new to my generation, that really affected me, and I had, I think, some body dysmorphia. I mean, just to call it out, I felt that I really had to be that cut to be sort of a good, an awesome man, and of course with all it's a little bit of a poisonous ideology to internalize. And the other one was, I think this is timeless, this has nothing to do with the 90s, is to be economically successful. So I would think of, I guess, again, this sounds so cheesy, but, I don't want to be murdering women, but I think of American Psycho. I think of Patrick Bateman type or something, some sort of
the guys that you admired as a view of masculinity.
Essentially, yeah. Patrick.
When I grow up, I want to be Patrick Bateman
and Tyler Durden, and Patrick Bateman. Sign me up.
Yeah. I don't know if the audience can see this, but I'm slowly backing away, protecting my core.
Well, it was covert. I'm shy to admit this, but I mean, you're asking the question. I'm being honest about it. These things did affect me to be this sort of hyper urbane, wealthy, condo dwelling urbanite. Seemed like, all right, that sounds cool. That's what a man should be. That's one element. Let me check that off. Get my white collar degree and access to that type of world. And the other part of it was, and have a bodacious cut bod. Very primitive stuff, but I have to say it really affected me.
And I think for me, I've besides people in my life, obviously my dad, my husband, I love those guys. They're definitions of masculinity for me. But if I have to look in more popular culture, the first person that comes to mind, I'll say is Barack Obama. Think of Barack Obama. Well, he's I guess there is also a physicality that plays in that comes into play there. He's tall and handsome, although that's not the main part of it. It's that he has this easy confidence that he exudes what I think of as power. Not just because he's the former president of the United States of America, but also that this is going to seem like a weird, well, it's just that he doesn't seem like he needs to fight back if someone says something absurd or ridiculous, that he knows his place and he knows who he is enough that if someone can throw an insult to him, he can just see it as kind of funny and chuckle because he just has that confidence. He isn't the one who's strong and confident enough that they don't need to fight.
It's funny because I had this visceral reaction. It's odd because I'm a fan of Barack Obama, and I think that he's the greatest president I've seen in my generation. Just classy, sophisticated, wonderful man. But it's interesting because I had this visceral reaction that it's not what I associate, however, with some sort of idealized masculinity in my narrative. Because, and I hate to say this,
well, yeah, you're looking for psychopaths.
Yeah,
Psychopaths.
well, no, I'll tell you. I think I reduced it. It's like this. I think, in my mind, a tinge of menace in a man is something. I know it's very problematic. I know it's something that's going to maybe put me in a toxic masculinity box. But if I'm going to be very honest about it, the notion of like sort of the roguish, sort of slightly menacing male as a trope in all sorts of cultural productions has an appeal that I don't think I can let go of. And I don't think a guy like Barack Obama has it. Everything you said is true, and I agree with.
He doesn't have that menacing part. But I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying before. And I guess maybe we're, in my own experience and kind of societally, traditionally, I'm in being a woman and being smaller in stature, not just, I'm like 5'3", 5'4". I'm not a very big lady. There's always that. There's always this presence in my mind that men in particular can aggress against me at any moment. And I try not to bring that to the forefront, but I recognize that. And to me, what I find appealing is a man who is strong and powerful and not menacing. Because there's that thought of, if I think of of course, like the Patrick Bateman or something like that, who was a serial killer of women, and that's scary.
He's also a parody. I mean,
he's also, yeah, sure, but
no,
in any of that spectrum, that's that would put me in the victim role of that. Even if he's a parody, it's supposed to be, he's just going to be kind of not nice to women or do something,
Well, I mean, look, in terms of this menace thing, I think it comes down to how it is expressed. It's a matter of taste. Like, look, one could say that if you're going to compare a guy like, say, Donald Trump to Barack Obama, I mean, Donald Trump has much more of a menace about him, and it's not a type of menace.
Which strikes me as a very beta male thing to do, because I just see it as if somebody needs to be aggressive, then unless in the the most extreme cases, if somebody is just aggressive and angry, to me it bespeaks a lack of power.
Well, I agree with you.
Because if you're powerful, you don't need to be aggressive. You're sure.
That's why I chose the word menace purposely, because I agree with you. I think the way that, in my view, the way that a guy like Trump expresses is just boorish. That's just like it's crude, it's vulgar. There's nothing elegant about that sort of male menace. To me, what is appealing in my idealized vision of the masculinity is that there should always be this tinge of male danger that's inherent to the male condition. So we're kind of starting this whole discussion that there's something, we are men biologically and culturally programmed in a context to have this great potential for violence and abuse. And I agree that, like I said earlier, to rein it in and to be chivalrous and a gentleman is what makes a man. But to have it completely evacuated, I think, does denature the man and feels not as appealing to me. There has to be something that is still there to feel manly or attractive. At that point, if I'm just going to be someone that follows all social conventions and is always like, opening doors saying yes, or being just overly mannered without some sort of,
gravitas
or some sort of
menace behind or threat behind it. Of if you don't actually comply, then something's going to happen.
Roguish individuality, sort of like the Clint Eastwoods or action movie tropes, that there's always the man who stands alone, the man who can make his own rules, but who still is a good man.
And to me, again, Barack Obama kind of represents that more. There is still a lot of power behind it. I guess that's sort of the difference. Notice I said Barack Obama and I didn't say Justin Trudeau, who's the Prime Minister of Canada presently. They're both powerful men. Of course, Justin Trudeau is presently in power and Barack Obama is former president of the United States. But Justin Trudeau, who's also very physically attractive and is a larger guy, I guess, he still strikes me as a little goofy and maybe a little bit ineffectual, like says a lot of words but doesn't necessarily follow through on what he says. Whereas my impression of Barack Obama is that he would say things and definitely not completely follow through, but there are a lot of things that he did follow through on despite a lot of objection and still had the courage of his convictions to keep moving forward. So, but without needing to resort to aggression as blatantly, let's say as a Trump who's just tantruming all over the place.
Finally, guys, what about the future of masculinity? Where is the male identity going next? If you take a look at, for example, Ken from Barbie and Ken, he's now panracial. He has a man bun. Is Ken going to be a better representation of tomorrow's man? And is the modern male going to change, but at the same time assert his masculinity? Or is just masculinity perhaps on the way out?
Well, I do think that this new Ken and this new Ken model that comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and color tones and personal styles, I do applaud it, and I think that it is catching up with what I think is the present and continuing to change an ever-changing image of masculinity, which is just simply more diverse. I mean, I think if anything, the notion of the bro, the classic stereotype of this beer guzzling, football loving man, frat boy, has become something that is derided by the smart set today, right? I mean, using the word bro is completely in scare quotes and kind of something ironic that people say today. And I think that's something that I've seen over the past, several years. It's something kind of new. There was a time when to be macho and all those stereotypical tropes were just dead serious. Like, that's what it is. And I think that today there's just so much more that's available. Again, the idea of the hipster man which is sort of the trend the millennials are associated with, is not the bro. And so I think that there are more available leading men today. So I think there's just more diversity in terms of what it means to be a man, and that's going to continue as we go forward.
I agree. I think the definitions of masculinity, continue to evolve and change as they should. I think now it's still, there's a lot of polarization. It may be that this is just a time for growth in the term, that right now there's still a bit of this, sort of the alt-right narrative of what a man is versus the, millennial kind of softer, friendly man bun version of what a man is. And those two images are really, very, very apart, very far apart now in terms of what a real man is. And I think that, we're just going to see where that ends up evolving to and what ends up happening with that. It may just be that as the definitions of masculinity start to change and shift and become a little bit more nurturing and involved in childcare and in grooming and in being societally helpful, that you're having maybe more of this kind of death throes backlash of this really hyper exaggerated version of masculinity from the alt-right that's sort of coming out. But I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. If I think even just in my own circle over my own life and my own experience, I think that the view of the man in family has definitely evolved over the course of my life. I find that when I was younger, we have a dad who was very, very involved in our child rearing. And so that wasn't necessarily as typical when we were kids. But I find now it is considered a bit more typical, and that a view of a man is, in this age of ever-increasing divorce and family dissolution, a man is someone who still has shared custody of his kids and who takes care of them and who helps them out and involves in a lot of that direct kind of parental labor. And I think that's definitely a shift as things have gone on. So we'll see where it continues to evolve.
And that's in the social realities of in terms of family. But when I think too, we're also living in the age of superhero films where there's all sorts of muscly superheroes running around dominating the box office. So it's not
Absolutely.
like it's gone,
Right.
the notion of the hyper-masculine male. Though I do think even in this current context, though, it's still a bit more knowing than it's ever been, a bit more self-aware than it's ever been. Even if I think of a guy like The Rock, right, who is this, this huge, muscly leading man who's very popular these days, there's something kind of goofy and self-knowing about how he brands himself, right? It's not as if, this is not the self-serious, like, Schwarzenegger of the 80s, right, where he's, like, in commando, and, like, though this is serious, like, I'm really hacking people up, and there is no tongue-in-cheek aspect to this, like, I'm an over-muscled alpha dog. And I think, so I think that even today, most men today, I think, are also aware of a lot of the sort of feminist critiques that have creeped into mainstream society. They're aware of expressions like, male gaze or manspreading. And so I think men are growing up today a bit more self-aware of the tropes of masculinity and are able to distance themselves from it in a way that I think they weren't able to before.
I think you're touching, if I think even just of current, more current cinema, like I can definitely see what you're saying. Even the hyper, if you go The Rock in Moana, in this Disney film, he was still, starts off as this very almost exaggerated male, hyper male, masculine, diminishing women character, but in the end ends up really kind of recognizing the female character's power and having much more power sharing and becoming much more modern, I guess, in our conception of masculinity. And if you look at even one of the most violent, extremely violent kind of superhero movies recently, Logan, that was, even in that role where Logan is one of the most extreme kind of macho superheroes and is hyper violent and hairy chest and everything else. He's
about fatherhood, yeah.
Yeah, the whole film is about fatherhood and actually giving kind of direct care, concern, and love that evolves over the course of the film. So you can almost see it as maybe an evolution of how we're seeing, his character, and then by extension, masculinity. That it's this, you can still have this sort of growth into responsibility and paternity in a real involved way.
I mean, that's a great example. I think it's also more of a sort of a serious Marvel film, a serious superhero film. But one thing comes to mind as we're talking about this. Think of the Expendables franchise, right? Which is very funny because if you think about it, that whole thing is in a way lampooning the macho action hero of yesterday, right? Every single guy in that franchise is an action movie star, and they're called the Expendables. And the whole point of it is that this is kind of a winking, sort of tongue-in-cheek nod to this self-serious action hero. And so I think, again, there's this distance that we have today that as a society that we see what these male tropes are, and we're able to call them out and not feel,
I guess, not take them as seriously, and also to see kind of the evolving role of parenthood. And of men, I guess, as women have gone more and more into the workforce, over the generations, and have, they have a lot more sharing in terms of the parental role, and men have had to kind of rise up and take more responsibility and direct childcare of their kids. I think that's one of the aspects of masculinity that I could see has sort of changed and evolved in terms of what it's viewed as now. That sort of caregiving role, particularly pertaining to family, and not just caregiving economically, but in terms of the actual labor of caregiving, then I think that's one of the changing definitions of masculinity that's coming up.
Further reading, viewing, or maybe lifting on the subject of masculinity?
I'm going to go actually with an article that I thought was, I was tempted to go for a whole bunch of different movie options, but I'm going to take a step back from that. And there's one, this article, The Weaponized Loser, by Stephen T. Asma, and that's on Aeon, aeon.co. It's one of the essays there. And I find it really has a very interesting exploration of how frustrated male desire and frustrated male achievement can kind of feed into a lot of aggression and violence kind of across the world. And it's a very interesting kind of presentation and theory, and really quite compelling and worth a read.
My endorsement shout out would be a film. I often go for film, In the Company of Men, which is
what a great choice.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite films, and this is from 1997, and the story is just about two men in the corporate world, and one is more, alpha than the other, and they start to bond with this toxic masculinity and start to play these vicious games on the women at the company that they're in. Sort of, I don't want to give too much away, but I think that's all what I love about this film. Why I think it's important for people to see. Something we didn't really talk about in this podcast is the one-upmanship that goes on between men when women are not around. That even as enlightened as I like to think I am as a male in today's day and age, when men get together, and especially when you're bonding, you don't really know them very well, you haven't opened yourself up much, there's that's often a place to go to, is to sort of some sort of jockey sort of sometimes misogynistic type of humor, or trying to male bond at the expense of our dignity as men, and it's so I think people should see it.
As a side note, this is actually a film that I showed a clip of when I was doing a talk on psychopathy, because I find that this is, In the Company of Men, has one of the best depictions I've seen of kind of the business psychopath. We think of psychopathy a lot as being this very, related to a lot of physical violence, and Robert Hare, one of the ones who coined the term psychopath and really popularized it, really talks about these non-physically aggressive psychopaths, these sort of business psychopaths. And I found that In the Company of Men just a beautiful, a really fantastic depiction, and it really overlaps, as you're saying, with toxic masculinity, this kind of jockeying for power. Great recommendation, Daniel.
Yeah. I'm a man.
And France will return later this month on the podcast as her reflection continues about her political career. But in the meantime, that was a great episode on masculinity. Samantha and Daniel, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, brah.
Don't forget
You guys gonna fight now? We're
gonna arm wrestle. Don't forget to hashtag the Goldwaters on social media. You can share the episodes. That is the only way to support us, so please do that. You can also drop us a line at talk@thegoldwaters.ca to tell us what you think about today's show or past episodes. Thanks again, Goldwaters.
Booga, 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 booga.
Provocateur.media